The days of working from home are fading for more employees.
The return to office trend may not only not have stalled, but gone backward.
A new study looking at the pros and cons of remote work.
Firms including now Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, Salesforce, and even the federal government, even Zoom, the company this is, now throwing in the towel on fully remote work.
They can work remotely and productively and have been doing it for 2.5, 3 years.
Disney recently announcing its employees will be required to spend 4 days a week on site.
We know we're not all going back to the way things were before.
But what does the research say?
We all know that remote work spiked during the pandemic. Before COVID-19, only about 6% of the US workforce worked completely remotely. By the spring of 2020, though, that number had risen to over 50%. Since the height of the pandemic, the number of people working fully remotely has steadily decreased, to the point where in 2023, it's about 28% of the workforce. With many executives and CEOs saying it's time to come back to the office, many of us wonder as we drive into work, is working in the office really better? And if it is better, is it just better for my boss or is it better for me too? If you look towards business leaders and academics, there isn't much agreement on the correct way forward. CEOs like Jamie Dimon, who's the CEO of JP Morgan, Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Meta, and David Solomon, the CEO of Goldman Sachs, are all pushing for in-person work. But there are also people and companies that see remote work as here to stay. For example, Kevin O'Leary says that refusing to hire remote workers is idiotic because it prevents companies from retaining the best talent. Whether top CEOs publicly say they are pro or anti-remote work, behind closed doors, they all seem to predict a rise in remote work. What do I mean by that? Well, each month there's a survey that goes out to top business leaders. It's called the Survey of Business Uncertainty. It's run by the Federal Reserve Bank, the University of Chicago, and Stanford, so some pretty credible names. In July of 2023, the survey asked this: looking forward to 5 years from now, what share of your firm's full-time employees do you expect to be in each of the following categories? Fully in person, hybrid, or fully remote in 2028? As you can see in the chart, executives expect both fully remote and hybrid work to continue to grow. Sure, they aren't predicting a massive change over the next 5 years, but those 3 or 4% increases in remote and hybrid work translate to thousands of jobs. So why do these leaders think that despite their best efforts, remote work will continue to increase? Well, that's what we're going to answer today, and it has a lot more to do with remote work actually being good for the greedy capitalist CEO than you might think. Hello, my friends. My name is Kobe Hunter, and before we jump into the 5 reasons why remote work will continue to increase, I just want to ask you a quick question. As you're watching this video, if you like the content or you think you would enjoy learning about other business topics in this style, consider clicking that little subscribe button. These videos take a ton of research and time to make, and subscribing is the best way to tell me that I'm doing a pretty good job. And now let's get into the 5 reasons why remote work won't go away and why it will actually increase. First, and bear with me here, as this one is by far the most obvious, and 2, 3, and 4 are way more interesting. As technology designed to facilitate remote work continues to evolve, we can expect a rising percentage of the workforce to adopt remote work. Think about it like this. If we rewind back to the 1960s, the traditional office was a paper-intensive environment where the idea of working from home was pretty much impossible. However, over time, the rise in personal computing and other technologies meant that we could accomplish the same things at home as we do in the office. Nowadays, we can answer emails from anywhere, and it's no big deal to be able to FaceTime or Zoom a colleague. Even as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, the only way you could do something like this was with a fancy TV set with hundreds of thousands of dollars of equipment. Now, any device can use video conferencing tech. Even as this tech increased in the past decade, though, the adoption of it on a wide scale was still relatively slow. Sure, people would do conference calls to save time and money from flying someone in just for an hour-long meeting, but people weren't generally working from home. It wasn't until COVID-19 that remote work really became a central part of business. COVID obviously forced everyone home, but just because the pandemic is over doesn't mean its effects are gone. During the pandemic, tons of startups and companies invested in remote work technologies, and as remote work became more similar to in-person work, the economic incentives to have employees work from home can continue to increase for both employers and employees. Economics is really at the center of the remote work/return to office debate. Even with the tech stuff that I just mentioned, as work from home tech became cheaper, its use began to proliferate. But now that people aren't being forced to work from home and get to choose, the question is raised: which is actually better? The scholarly research on the effectiveness of working from home versus working in the office and which brings better returns for shareholders is inconclusive at best and contradictory at worst. Some studies like this one from Stanford say that the remote workers are 10 to 20% less productive, while this study by Harvard Business Review says that employees are actually more productive when they're working from home. Now, I'm sure you can see the arguments on both sides. On the Stanford study side, if you aren't in the office, you could be taking a 15-minute laundry folding break, or doing the dishes during a meeting rather than taking notes. But on the Harvard side, you don't waste time going out to eat at lunch when working from home because you have a whole entire kitchen right there that you can eat from. And you don't spend time chit-chatting with your coworkers at the water cooler or in the hallway. Plus, without your long commute, you're more likely to put in an extra 15 minutes with some of the extra time on your hands. Why would they pay for you to drive when they could pay for you to work? Because the scientific evidence isn't conclusive, most firms are doing what their CEOs feel is best. And because the majority of CEOs have worked their entire lives in an in-person setting, it makes sense that they revert back to what has worked. But over time, despite the arguments about effectiveness, we do know that remote work requires lower fixed costs, and companies wanting to gain a pricing edge, or startups who just can't afford expensive office space, will capitalize on remote working arrangements. Why would a cash-strapped business spend $20,000 a month renting out a place for employees to work when they can outsource that cost to their employees, and the employees would actually be happy about it? Even for larger companies that have the budget, executives will begin to ask if spending $1 million a month on a lease is really the best use of their capital. Obviously, it depends on your company, but on average, about 10% of overhead costs are rent. It's easy to say, come back to the office when you have to use that office space because you have a lease on it for the next 3 years. But when that lease becomes due, despite the arguments about employee effectiveness, a lot of companies will choose to save the millions and use that money to invest in their businesses in other ways. Third, and this one is really US specific and not kind of obvious until you think about it, but the US is really well positioned for a remote work environment. The US has one of the highest rates of remote work of any developed country. Only New Zealand and Canada have more remote work among the 34 countries surveyed in this academic paper. Intuitively, this makes sense. Remote work is a form of decentralization and personal autonomy. It gives employees more discretion over where, how, and when they work. And Americans love personal autonomy. Americans, on average, are much more individualistic than people in other countries. On top of this, US companies on average are said to have better management practices than firms in other countries. And in order for remote work to be successful, you really need to have a good management team. On top of a love for individualism and good management, US workers tend to have larger homes, which makes it easier to have a dedicated workspace and not be distracted by other people or children. The US also has longer commute times than pretty much any other country, with the average American spending an hour each day commuting to and from work. The saved time of not having to commute a couple of days a week in a hybrid model, or ever in a remote model, is really attractive to employees because they save time and money. This economic incentive for employees leads us to the fourth reason why remote work will continue to rise, and that's economic incentives, but for employers. As we talked about in part 2, some studies do suggest that working from home is about 10% less productive than working on site. However, this 10% decrease in productivity is not necessarily a net negative for employers because remote work can lead to cost savings above and beyond the reduced fixed costs of not having to pay for an office that we talked about earlier. In a remote work system, since you can hire people from anywhere in the country, you can pay people less because you don't have to pay them more for living in an expensive city. The work an associate consultant does at Bain is the same exact work whether they live in New York or Dallas. But if you're an analyst that lives in New York, Bain has to pay you $157,000 a year rather than $100,000 a year in Dallas. That's 50% more just because New York City is really expensive. Let's say the Stanford study is right, and remote work is about 10% less effective across the board. Even if all of your employees were 10% less effective, but they cost, let's say, a conservative 30% less to employ, you as the CEO would probably be pretty happy with this arbitrage opportunity. Now, even if you're not going to go fully remote and benefit from paying people less because they live in lower cost of living areas, hybrid options have been shown to have little effect on net productivity and also have saved on the fixed costs we mentioned earlier. Finally, the last reason why remote work will increase is because employees like it. And when employees like things, employers try to cater to it to attract the best talent, even if they drag their feet at first. Just think about how trendy so many workplaces have become as the trend of fun, college campus-like workplaces pioneered by tech companies spread to other firms. Research evidence suggests that working from home is valued by employees about the same on average as an 8% pay increase. Working from home also is valued by employees and employers because it helps reduce turnover, which saves companies money and makes people's lives better. According to the National Bureau of Economic Research, working from home can reduce employee turnover by as much as 35%. This is a huge economic advantage to employers because hiring and training new employees is extremely expensive. According to the Society for Human Resource Management, the total cost of hiring a new employee is about 3 times the person's annual salary. So if you're looking to hire an entry-level position making, say, $60,000 a year, you may spend up to $180,000 a year just trying to fill that role. Thus, reducing turnover at a company can save millions of dollars a year. While the future extent of how much work will be remote work is uncertain, the long-term economic incentives are there for companies to further adopt it as their new normal. Remote technologies will only get better, and employees will gravitate to firms with more flexible policies, and despite all the benefits for employees that we've gone through today, the biggest reason that the return to office push won't work is the fact that the economic incentives for profit-seeking executives actually lie in a remote work setup. Now, I'd love to hear from you on if you think remote work will stay or increase or decrease. Do you agree with the reasons I outlined? If not, let me know why in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.